Do Prime Minister when you're ready. Prime Minister when you're ready.
All right, sorry. Like I said, POIs in the chat, please. If I don't say anything after like a few minutes, feel free to do it verbally, but I'll try to be reasonably quick about it. All right, cool. Uh, sorry. Three, two, one. Right off the bat, I just want to kind of say what I think this narrative looks like, right, and what the world without it would look like. So I think this narrative looks like somewhat a societal belief that parents should have some inherent happiness from parenting, right? This means that on average, if all other things are equal, they expect that, parents should take pride in their kids. They should be fulfilled as a consequence of their kids' accomplishments or just as a consequence of their kids' existence to some extent innately, right? This likely stems from two things. One, which I think is a biological constant in this round, which is that yes, there is some natural attachment to your children and fulfillment from your children that is probably a milder amount. It's probably symmetric in either world as a sole consequence of, like genetic imperative stuff like that. I think that's not where this debate lies. That's symmetric, obviously. What is more consequential in this debate is that kind of irrational tipping factor that expects the average individual to say, yes, I'm happy being a parent, even if that's not the reality, right? So what does the world without this look like broadly? Well, I think first of all, it's a world of better parents and better parenting, right? I'll get on to that as my two main points very specifically in a second, but I just want to give a little bit of broad framing on that too. What I think the world without this looks like is number one, more rational decision making on whether to have a family or not, right? As a consequence of the fact that, a irrational factor, a external weighing factor will be removed. And also, as I'll kind of just about in a point too, I think it looks like a world of more support for family planning. But I'll get on to some mechanization and probability based justification for those in just a second. So, any points of clarification on the framing? Seeing none, I'll jump to the first point, which I think will have massively better parents in the society. Three main mechs for this. The first is that essentially just the probabilistic selection process for who chooses to be a parent improves, right? People who do choose to be a parent are more likely to make a rational decision if rational factors are removed. Let's think about what other factors go into having a child. One is societal pressure on families, right? Society wants families to exist. I think this is something we can all agree to. This is highly likely symmetric. Number two is the belief that it will make yourself slash partners happy. This is a belief which I think in reality is not fulfilled in many cases because people buy into the societal narrative until they have a personal experience to prove it otherwise, which happens in many cases in the status quo right now. And finally, the belief you can raise a child well, which, I'll get on to my second point. Why is this a problem in the status quo? Because when you believe that it will make yourself slash your partners or whatever happy, right? And it ends up not doing it for some reason or another, whether it's temporary, whether, I'll get on to some of those reasons in a sec, that leads to personal dissatisfaction as well as lower quality parenting, right? So that's the first big hit right there. Is just probabilistically parenting will increase in quality in Gov's world. That's a very clean impact. Second mech here. We'll have more societal support for parenting. First of all, what does this look like? We think there'll be more political capital, both in time and discussion and actual fund allocation to fund things like parent-child programs, daycare, more resources published and made available for family planning online, more assistance with family planning on a social and community level, more support and support groups around things like parents that aren't happy, dissatisfaction, better programs around orphanages and things like adoption and things like that, since it won't be viewed as taboo to, have issues with your family, and society will want to support that to a large level. Yeah, POI from O before I continue.
The issue is that complaining that things are imperfect is not a good way to get support because there are endless numbers of difficulties in someone's life. When you say that being a parent is fulfilling and I can't achieve that fulfillment without the support, it's a way better way to get money.
Uh, I seem to be missing that slightly, right? I think if the idea is that complaining things that aren't perfect isn't a good way to get progress, I think the key point here is that things aren't perfect in either world. And in our world, the ability for others to recognize that things aren't being perfect isn't an internal flaw to the parents, right? Others won't say, well, the fact that you don't enjoy having a family represents something's wrong with you because everyone else in society gets inherent fulfillment from being a parent. They are more likely to buy authentically into supporting them, whether this looks like bringing helping cook a meal for a neighbor, something extremely marginal impact, or whether it looks like a very large impact, like a societal level childcare program, a societal level daycare program, right? No matter the cost, people are more likely to have empathy and actual rational understanding of what others are going through. So I'm not quite, you can elaborate on that in your speech. So, but also just for a little bit of probability based justification for why this is likely, I think people, when they don't expect others to enjoy parenting, but society still views having a family as a good thing, right? We think the societal pressure on having families in general will probably still exist to a large scale, means that if one of the big factors motivating people to become parents doesn't exist, society will likely and governments will likely tip the scales in some other way to have families. This is a justification for why it's probable to get more childcare, probable to get more subsidies, probable to get more maternity and paternity leave, massively positive things like this that increase the capacity for the average individual, even in a capitalist society, to parent at a better level. Finally, oh yeah, okay, cool. Third mechanism here. I think this will normalize treatment for things like postpartum depression, even retroactively. Look, there are lots of physiological and psychological consequences of pregnancy on birthing people, right? For example, postpartum depression, many mothers feel an intense depression immediately after giving birth, right? The rush of hormones and the actual physiological changes you experience immediately after childbirth. This isn't like a lot of other impacts on state, which I think are going to be more soft, philosophical, like happy sadness things. This is a very tangible, like immediate physical impact. And like this is I can confidently say that we would have had systemic recognition of these real conditions and treatment for these real conditions far earlier in Gov's world, right? Far earlier where this narrative doesn't exist. Why? Because I think society will be much more likely to recognize that, hey, there's actually if when people aren't feeling happy immediately after giving birth, there's not just something wrong with them. There's not just something wrong with their outlook on life. There's something more endemic or systemic going on here, right? This is something resolvable. We're not just going to label them aberrant and discard them. We're going to try and resolve this on a systemic level to improve society. I think we get this decades, if not centuries sooner. The impact here on multiple fronts is massively better quality of life for parents, right? We're raising the average happiness of both birth people and just all parents and guardians in general. But it ties me to my second point too, which is I think you get better parenting, which I'll tie into the impact of actual better life for children. Two main mechs for this. The first mech is that parents won't expect children to inherently provide happiness and be disappointed when they're let down. Now, why is this likely to happen, right? Because when parents don't view children as inherent fulfillment, they're much more likely to say, well, I'm raising this child. This is something I chose to do. Let's kind of see how it pans out. They'll still be hopeful for their child, all those positive things like that. But we don't think it's likely that they'll be disappointed when the child doesn't make them happy, like losing sport events. They won't take it out on their child. What does this disappointment look like? Potentially in high impact case, neglect and abuse, right? Obviously, very tangible high end impacts. We don't think these are the most probable outcome. The most probable outcome is more likely not affirming children, not supporting their goals, right? Not congratulating your children after success, but being perhaps withdrawn or harsh after their failures. The second mech here is that parents are more likely to value children as individuals and not extensions of themselves. Why? Firstly, we think legacy narratives and like the belief that children are supposed to carry on after you and be a source of fulfillment are less probable, right? When you don't have fulfillment narratives. And number two, that kids' actions and success are less likely to be a point of pride or disappointment when parenting is a more objective, rational decision with less emotion tethered to it. That wraps up my time. My second speaker, myself, will expand. Thank you, panel.
Great, thanks, Bree, for that fine speech. Now I invite the leader of opposition when you're ready.
Okay. Everyone all good? Yeah. Cool. Oops. Oh, sorry. POIs, you can do either chat or raise your hand. Raise your hand's probably better though. Okay. Raising a child is just a beautiful thing for many, many people. Holding a small hand, watching a baby reach for you for a hug, remembering the first time you kissed someone, and getting to support your child through the very same process and enjoying all of the nostalgia that comes with this. This is a moment, years really, of beauty and of fulfillment. And getting support, getting to encourage parents, this is all critical work that we support on opposition. A couple of notes. First, I want to set out two frames, then I'll give one response and two constructive arguments. One on why this makes being a parent far easier, and second on why we actually get to access proper types of fulfillment for parents when they make this decision. First of all, on framing. The first thing I want to note is that fulfillment is not the same as perfection in the way that opening government hopes to characterize this round, which is to say the narrative is not that being a parent is a perfect thing and that every experience in it goes amazingly. It is that it is fulfilling. And our conception as society of what fulfillment is deeply tied to hardship, which is to say debating is not perfect, but it is fulfilling because through the fourths, through the thirds, through the losses, things that you get out of it in terms of enjoyment, in terms of the community and the friendship and the networks that you form are things that you value and can allow you to look back on that experience and enjoy and derive meaning from it. So fulfillment and perfect enjoyment are different things, and you should notice that because that is just not how we think about something being fulfilling. The second thing I want to know is that the counterfactual on their side can be quite bad, which is to say things probably do get a lot worse on their side. Though that being said, I'll probably deal with their case mostly under their best case scenario just for the sake of charitability. But I do want to point out that society still wants to have kids. Governments want to have a workforce to be able to provide for an aging population so you don't have that reverse triangle going forward. That's why my home province uses tax breaks for people as they have more and more children. The difference then is that this narrative likely becomes painted as one of duty, that you ought to have a child, that it is your responsibility to society to improve it. And as a result, organizations like the prescriptive patriarchy, which impose upon women the position of motherhood, oftentimes get empowered to make this a decision that parents have to make, not ones they get to make, and not ones they get to derive fulfillment out of. So the encouragement and the notion that you should be supported by society gets eliminated, and what is replaced is a narrative that this is what you have to do. One response quickly. I want to point out that their claim that everyone is doing this and is having fun is just wrong. It doesn't align at all to what we think about when we see our parents. When I see my brother and sister-in-law raising their child, I don't think that the fact that the baby is up for like 20 hours of the day is probably making them so fucking happy, and they're like, oh wow, this is great, they must be loving this, right? It is just obvious things that you can see the difficulty, but you think that it is important that you provide them with the means, that you be supportive, because this is something that they're supposed to enjoy and that we can help them to enjoy that. That is just how rational people interact with the institution of parenthood. Let's try and contain this round to the realm of logic and how people operate. First argument then on why this makes being a parent easier. Being a parent is painted by our society as something that is sacred. It is something that is super important and things that we care about. We think that they are so important, doing truly meaningful work and rearing the next generation, which we really care about. So our claim then is that the narrative of fulfillment leads to increases in support. And we think that people have a right to enjoy their experience as a society, and this is as parents, and that is critical. That is to say that fulfillment is something that everyone ought to be able to access from the institution of parenthood. That means that parenthood should be fulfilling. And so people give you loads of support to parents as a result. How does this come about? One, I think that first of all, because fulfillment is so deeply tied to the notion of hardship, people want to empower you to be able to overcome that hardship. So support for things like postpartum depression actually emerges as a result of the fact that we think that if you're not enjoying parenthood, if you're not being able to fulfill yourself, then something is wrong and that society has failed your ability to access that. But second of all, because we view fulfillment as something that is genuinely incredible, there is lots of obsession as a society around the notion of fulfillment. We think that it is so beautiful. We think the idea of finding your passion is something that is so important. We want everyone to have access to that. As a result, we think that these parents are highly deserving and are doing noble work and important work. And so it is something special that people are envious of, that we want to be able to allow them to access this, because there is such sort of like cultural significance placed around the notion of fulfillment, and we value people accessing it. But the third thing is, we want people to be able to actually get fulfillment out of it. Like at some level, this is actually like a logical narrative, which is to say that like, in order to be fulfilled, you need to be able to do things like spend time with your children. So that's why institutions like paternal and maternal leave develop, because we think that you cannot get fulfillment if you do not actually get the support from society to be able to spend time with your children. In societies like Quebec, you have huge extended years of maternal leave because of the fact that fulfillment and the notion of parenthood is so culturally tied. Why is this a better way of accessing help? Because this gives a clear endpoint for what help is trying to achieve, whereas just saying that everyone is really miserable doesn't seem to get a lot. Second of all, this is really fulfilling. The first thing I want to point out is why we think parents will choose well. One, this is not the only source of information. You see friends who have children. You see your parents with your younger siblings. You see your siblings start to have children. You know that it is very difficult and that there is a lot of hardship involved. Second, this is not the only thing in your life that has ever been portrayed as fulfilling. Things like having a marriage, things like having a fulfilling career. These are all things that society also tells you are very valuable things that you can be doing in your 20s and 30s. The point is, you can choose, but two, the same sources of pressure that exist on our side exist on theirs. Your parents are still telling you that they want you to have grandchildren. So the delta for them is actually quite small if we ignore the notion that this is painted as a duty. It is probably very woke individuals who have a sense of like their own sort of like importance and therefore reject the institution of parenthood as opposed to like people generically. CG, go.
Yeah, so given all of your framing about why parents want this, government wants this, why do they not also have an incentive to provide you with support so that people do it and don't revolt against their narrative because they think it's abusing them and creating bad outcomes?
I don't understand. Like that suggests that we have this narrative, it provides you support, and then you get the support out of it. So it's good. Why is this fulfilling? You get a lot of parenting that only we can access because parenting is framed as something that ought to be enjoyed. The first thing is it means that you can take good out of inevitable hardships. That when things are difficult, then when you're not sleeping a lot, that society says that there is something positive to be taken from that. But second, it means that you raise your children slightly differently. It's that you're supposed to enjoy your time with your children. So you do things like go to playgrounds rather than sit at home all day and suffer in the fact that like they've been awake for so freaking long. That means that this notion of enjoyment directs the way that what you are pursuing and what you are attempting to do it as a parent, which improves things for yourself and for your child. Third, it means that like parenting just achieves like very generically positive things that everyone gets to access now, even if they make the wrong decision, which is to say social networks that you now get to preserve as an old person because of the relationships that your child formed that connected you to other people. But fourthly, it just means that people are more likely to save because like they have long-term financial goals for being able to raise a family. And as a result of that, they make better decisions going forward. And all of that is helpful for people, even in our worst case, which is you've made the wrong call. On that, oppose.
Thanks, Speaker, for that speech. Now invite the Deputy Prime Minister when you're ready.
All right, cool. A reminder, POI's in the chat, and yep, I'll jump right into it. 3, 2, 1. So I think it's rather funny that O tries to talk about how we're unrealistic and we're irrational decision making, right? They have this really hard push. They're like, well, people will still make rational decisions. We need to be realistic about that. Then they go on to basically list out all the things. We're like, yeah, these things are fun to do with your children. Parents like to go outside. Parents like to raise children. These things are all inherently valuable and fun. But if we don't have a fulfillment narrative, they might not do them, right? I can't wrap my head around an even one hypothetical situation why if a parent knows it would be more fun to go outside with their kid than sitting inside being miserable, they wouldn't do it unless a fulfillment narrative exists. This narrative is not the delta on decisions like that, right? I think OO has completely missed where the delta lies in this debate. I don't think this delta lies very largely on small decisions where the immediate impacts are obvious. Yes, people will choose to do things which they think will make them happier. We all agree to that in this debate. That's an incredibly obvious and fundamental thing, right? Where the delta lies in this debate is, are they making a correct or an incorrect decision? That panel is what I'm going to explain to you in this speech, and that is where I think we're very clearly taking it over O at this point. So how am I going to use that to clash against their points pretty heavily, right? Their first point about like the duty thing, I'll actually address another point that I bring up later on, so just table that for the moment. But looking at their positive matter about parenting and how fulfillment leads to increases in support, right? I think what they've neglected to notice here, when you consider my point that people are going to do what makes them happy anyways, right? People are going to do that, whatever. Then the actual delta on this point is whether or not society at the top level is providing would provide more resources than they do in the status quo today, right? That's where the delta lies. And I provided some pretty solid justification which they actually haven't engaged with for why that would be the case. When you look at things like more political capital, because people who are seen as not enjoying these things are actually recognized as a legitimate problem, that's a serious problem. That's a serious thing, right? I'm certain that OO's response to this, and the response they gave you, is something along the lines of, well, if it's fulfilling, then people want them to be fulfilled, so they'll provide them more resources. In reality, though, people don't actually care too much about where the fulfillment beyond it as a means to happiness. How do I know this? OO told us this is the highest value fulfillment in society, right? This is where you get your long-term stable happiness from. So if a government or an institution or an individual or anyone in your social circle thinks that, hey, I can make this person happier by, doing something to help their parenting situation, they're likely to do that anyways, right? Now, where do we get the unique delta in our case? Where does the actual change come from? Our change comes from the perspective on society as a whole that when people don't actually enjoy parenting inherently, when there's a fundamental thing, there's some fundamental clash, they're dealing with some physiological disorder like postpartum depression or something like that, that isn't a moral failure, that isn't a flaw, that isn't a dereliction of their duty to society, right? Rather, this represents an actual tangible issue which can be resolved. It's much along the lines of how people, it's much along the lines of when people say, what? You have a high-paying job and you're not happy, that doesn't make any sense, right? You look at these base level broad assumptions about what should be fulfilling, and there's not much support for people for alternatives to these things, for people who don't fit into these norms. I think for your average person who's like an averagely happy parent who has average access to services, not much is changing in either world, right? I think OO massively overreaches in the delta here. The actual largest change is for people on the fringes, people who are perhaps uncertain about having a child in the first place, but are pushed to have a child because there's a sadness in their life and they expect childhood to fill that deficiency. That is a huge problem, panel, right? That delta right there is a tipping point largely in this situation. Now, I think that kind of heavily addresses why I've actually laid out a unique delta. Oh, sure, I'll take a POI from OO. If that's what, yeah.
If parenting is just supposed to be hard then, as you say, and it's normal that it sucks, why doesn't this just normalize the idea instead of prompting solutions for it?
Yeah, so if we look at other things in society, which historic, this House regrets motion, right? This isn't changing today. If we look at other things historically in society which have been laid out as difficult, almost every single one of them in the span of hundreds of years has been massively addressed and handled on a systemic level with large-scale society reforms and sweeping changes to handle. Looking at automation, looking at things like agriculture, even if you want to go that far back, right? These are things when humanity faces large-scale problems, which a lot of people suffer from, we say, how can we fix these on a top-down scale? With this specific example, however, we say parenting should be fulfilling, right? There is dragging feet to actually try and resolve this large scale issue. There's dragging feet to say, well, you know, if the average person should be fulfilled by this, why should we have any systemic support for this issue? Now, we have got some systemic support in the status quo, right? Because I think there has been actually some death of this narrative in the status quo in some areas, and that's why we've gotten some of the systemic support. But I want to move on from that main clash because I think we've put ourselves ahead of that and address this other clash where they flagged that as not taking us at our best, but I think it's a fair contention in this debate, which is about duty and like the notion of duty and why I'm going to actually turn this point on the topic of feminism. This is our third argument here, which is essentially, you know, about feminism, right? I think the notion that being a parent is fulfilling actually does more to box women into the role historically than any other notions or any alternatives, right? They try to tell you the counterfactual is a duty notion around marriage, around parenting, which, let's be clear, exists and is somewhat symmetric, right? When in reality, what I think we're likely to see is a more equitable distribution of who's responsible for parenting in our world. Why is this the case? Two main reasons, right? Number one, when you're looking at who historically has been assigned to fulfill their duty in families, it's women. Women are the ones who've been barred most largely from accessing other forms of fulfillment, right? This looks like economic fulfillment. This looks like social fulfillment. They're more likely to be kept in a domestic environment by the patriarchy, right? And by a husband or things like that historically. Now, if women don't have access to other forms of fulfillment, but I think, OO told us, we all agree, fulfillment is something people pursue. They are much more probable to pursue parenting and taking on the lion's share of the responsibility for that as a individual responsibility and as someone which they're burdened with, right? So that explains on an individual level why we've seen throughout history, you know, this fulfillment narrative used as a tool to cement the patriarchy to some extent. But also on a macro systemic level, I think it's important to recognize that this fulfillment narrative is far easier to weaponize than any other narratives that could possibly exist by the establishment. Why is this? Well, first of all, when you look at political momentum around things like potentially, you know, trying to standardize care, trying to provide like women's suffrage and voting and things like that, a large pushback is, wait, no, but women have this responsibility, and we're not unethical in boxing into that because it's fulfilling, right? I agree there's a big hump in viewing women as equals throughout history, but once that hump is reached, it's very easy for the majority and the controlling class, which throughout most of history was men, to say, but women are fulfilled by this. And as long as everyone, including women, bought into that narrative historically, it's actually easy to justify keeping them in the domicile and keeping them as child raising. The clean impact here is without that narrative, there has to be an actual systemic, rational justification, which frankly, I think we can all agree wouldn't exist. More equitable society. That wraps up my time. Thank you.
Thanks for that fine speech. Now I'm at the DLO whenever you're ready.
I take POIs exclusively visually, so please turn on your cameras, give me a wave. Don't type anything into the chat, including time signals or POIs. It really distracts me. And finally, in general, I like it when people have their cameras on because it makes me feel less lonely. So if you could do that, that'd be awesome. I want to start by characterizing the counterfactual, because I think the group of people for whom this is the primary narrative affecting whether or not they have children is actually pretty small. These are young, woke people with pretty permissive families and social networks that won't restrain or judge them excessively for not having children. What are these pressures? There are a few things. A lot of it is rooted in patriarchy traditionally, right? Like the notion that men have to have kids to continue the patrilineal line, that a part of being a woman is having children, and that failing to do so is irresponsible or turning your back on your unique biological functions. So it's much more a narrative about duty. The reason why fulfillment is great is two things. The first thing is because it distances itself from really sexist notions of responsibility, and two, because it democratizes the notion of parenthood, because nothing about the fact that you might hold a child and connect with them for the first time is unique to only women, which is why I think that the final thing that DPM just said is exactly an argument for our side. That is encouraging men to actively invest in parenthood because it's such a special experience is something that's necessary towards lowering the load on women. The second thing I want to do is talk about then what the group of people for whom the decision making might flip is. Because I think like a lot of the OG analysis is that the parenting becomes better because people who are unfit to have children, who don't inherently want children, now have kids, and that's really, really great. So my main issue here is that this is a pretty small group of people. And I think that the issue is that generally, I think by and large, the majority of these young woke people are better off when they have children than when they choose not to do so as a result of this narrative disappearing, for a couple of reasons. The first thing is because I think the benefits of parenthood generally are really, really transformative, because once you're 21 and you start having a job, it just your life stretches out endlessly in front of you, right? It's just years and years and years of working the same job. Like some of us will be really, really lucky. Like we'll be born with like innate like interests that mean that we hyperfixate on like trains or something, and we can pursue that joy into the future. Or others might be wealthy and have a ton of social mobility and be able to invest into traveling worldwide, whatever. The thing is though, I would posit that even those forms of happiness are secondary to having a child, because that gives you a sense of creation, of leaving a legacy, of forming a connection of love with another human being that are different, number one. But two, because it gives your life meaning. You have goals in a way that is very, very difficult for you to have the self-control to construct by yourself, because otherwise it's really easy to get stuck inside your own head. So for those reasons, I think people by and large should have kids. The thing is though, that usually people don't in this category if they're not given this push. And the reason for this is it's really easy to procrastinate having a child, because it requires you to do things like give a down payment on a house, for example, to save up, to make sure that you coordinate with your parents whether or not you're going to live in the same area so the grandparents can help you raise the kid. Like all of these things are things that make people's lives much, much better and don't happen on their side. True, there are some parents for whom having a child is a bad idea because they really do feel strongly negatively towards it. In these cases, though, I think that this narrative is not really targeted towards them for two reasons. The first thing is because people who feel really, really strongly against having children, I think usually know that this is the case, whereas people who are ambivalent towards it usually realize that this is like, something that ends up playing out for the best. But the second main reason for this is because like, even if it was the case that people hate having kids at the end of the day, like oftentimes they just don't know whether or not it's going to be good or not. And for those reasons, I think that they're really touched by this narrative. So for those reasons, I think we have benefits, the vast majority of people in this group who become happier as a result. At scale, this obviously also has repercussions for the population. It becomes more evenly distributed. Okay. Second main argument is about how, for the majority of these people who have kids either way because of these social pressures, that life becomes much better. The first says you get tangible policy benefits. So the claim we get from OG is that fulfillment silences your ability to express dissatisfaction. I think Isaac really cleanly defeats this by explaining that fulfillment is not about enjoyment on a surface level. It's about a feeling of like full satisfaction that goes beyond the difficulties you have on a day-to-day basis, and in fact is enhanced by it. So I just don't think that this mutual exclusivity claim is true. But the second thing is, I think the bigger reason why parents don't get support is because parenthood is often mutually exclusive with profit motive, because companies have to trade off workers' productivity to give them leave, for example, and therefore that requires sacrifice. Eli says, well, if the government wants you to have kids, then they'll provide the service to you anyway, right? They'll just give you those policies because they want you to have children. Two responses. The first thing is, even though this is good for the government, they have lots of competing obligations. So, for example, the business owners lobbying against requiring paternal leave because it would increase the costs for for them, for example. And oftentimes, if it comes down just to this, like to one-to-one calculus, the benefits of parenthood are so long-term that no government is going to care about it because the benefits kick in when they're out of office. But number two, because there's a huge amount of difference between policies and encourage you to have kids. For example, making it easier for you to get a mortgage, which is a really immediate large benefit that people can be attracted by right now, and the policies that make it easier to have children, like once you already have those kids, you make parents' lives easier, if that makes sense. Because for the latter, it's things such as subsidizing free childcare, daycare, some things like that. But people don't realize how attractive they are until they already have kids and start realizing these problems. At that point, the incentive to make these people have kids just is irrelevant. The issue is that fulfillment is absolutely key because it claims that there's a source of happiness and fulfillment that is different to and higher than the practical considerations that governments and bosses are otherwise weighing. Because oftentimes, if you're just weighing it on a cost-benefit kind of way, that the scales don't fall on the side of having a child. Whereas when you say that this is a human right that is really beautiful, that is unique, that is more important than whether or not we're able to make more money, that's the point at which people listen when you force them to kind of like confront that this is something they need to become better parents. But the second thing is that you also want, the second benefit that we have is that people enjoy parenthood much, much more. And I think this is generally a really big part of the debate and possibly the most important benefit, because narratives are like one moving piece among lots of different practical pieces, but they do directly affect the schema, the lens through which people perceive their own experiences. For example, having a child. The response we get from OG to parents become much more fulfilled and they do things like take their children to the park, for example, is if it's fun, they'll just do it anyway. Two things. The first is this just isn't true because fun is something that parents can very happily trade off because fun is less important than putting food on the table, for example, or just like having a sleep. The thing is though, fulfillment teaches you that if you don't do this right now, this time will slip away and be irrevocably lost. And you should seize this moment while you can because it's really, really special towards you. And that kind of calculus is necessary to overcome the inertia that prevents people and causes them regret in their later years when they look back and miss out on this beautiful thing otherwise. Happy to oppose.
Thanks, speaker, for that. Sorry, thanks, speaker, for that speech. Now, speakers for a top half. Now, invite the member of government when you're ready. Thanks, speaker, for that speech. Now, invite the member of opposition when you're ready.
All right, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I'll take a POI at around like 5 minutes or so. Just put in chat if you have one. Yeah, just please don't interrupt me. Okay. 5, 4, 3, 2. Wait, sorry. Wait 1 sec. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. When my mom tells me the stories of her playing sports with her friends at university, or she tells me how much she misses being around her family or reminiscing about playing basketball on her varsity school team, I can't help but feel an immense guilt knowing the sacrifice that she made for me to give up her future so I could have one in Canada. When I cried into her arms telling all the things I wish I could give her because nothing feels like enough to repay her, she told me, Tyler, there's nothing you need to do but be happy because that is what makes it all worth it. So when government bench hangs their hat on the idea that there are potential harms if there is an incongruency between what you feel as a parent and what you are told to feel, that is an argument against anything worth valuing in the first place. You might hate what you're doing as a job. Do we tell people to lie down and take it, or do we tell people you should try to find fulfillment still in the labor that you do? So any argument government brings to suggest that there are potential harms to this narrative, if it is not perfectly internalized, doesn't do anything to actually support their side speaker unless they can prove that the value people do gain from this narrative being absent is less important than the harm they that you could otherwise get. Then I want to talk about the rest of the debate. I want you to note then that the deadlock of assertion the rest of this debate kind of exists in. Government says that if someone finds parenthood fulfilling, the existence and value of parenthood is symmetric. We shouldn't influence people, therefore, to enter parenthood if that's not something they find valuable. Opening opposition says that, well, actually the narrative is very important because parenthood is valuable, it's noble. People should be encouraged to take on parenthood when they aren't sure if that's the choice for them. It might not always be a perfect experience, but something that's still worth doing in the first place. Note that the key assumption behind these two positions in this debate is that it assumes fulfillment is intrinsic to parenthood because you either experience fulfillment or you don't. The first part of extension is very simple. We're going to break this deadlock by explaining what fulfillment is a practice and not intrinsic to parenthood. As such, we need this narrative for people to make the choices, to do the actions, and to influence their perceptions of the relationships that they form and the actions that happen within their lives they have with their families to build meaning for themselves. Because fundamentally, our position is that people are great at finding meaning in things that even if they don't make them directly happy. Why is this narrative so necessary then? Because parenthood is not easy. No parent is ever going to tell you that they're always happy in their parenthood. No parent will ever say that they never feel snippets of regret when their child does something that gets on their nerves. But even in those moments, what a lot of them will say is that they're still fulfilled despite being upset. And this is exclusively enabled by a narrative that encourages them to take action every day to try and construct meaning for themselves. When you drop $30K a year in tuition on this kid, when you can no longer go on your own vacation because you have to take care of them, when they embarrass you in public, that might suck in the moment. But when you genuinely feel that parenthood should be something that you ought find meaning in, as this narrative tells you to, you will find meaning insofar as you genuinely believe this is something that is worth finding meaning in the first place. Why is this important, right? Because this debate isn't just about people who are deciding whether parenthood is for them, notably directly or feeding CG. It's also about people who already have families. What the other teams in the debate also ignore then is that this narrative is present all throughout parenthood beyond just the calculus of whether this is something that you want to enter. And this goes into my next point, right? Which is that people are short-termists. It's very difficult to think in the long term and to see what parenthood brings for you, because the sacrifices that you make carry strong negative emotions, like the fear of missing out, like resentment, like of anger. It is difficult oftentimes then to look past those emotions when they do happen. And again, having this narrative is important for that because it makes it so that you recognize that behind the emotions that I'm feeling right now, there is a longer goal at hand. There's a longer pursuit of meaning at hand that I'm trying to contextualize in every experience that I have with this child that, I've decided to enter this relationship with. Note how then that CG ignores all of this when it comes to the meaning construction, when Eli says that this debate is applicable mostly to pre-parenthood because you have yet to experience the experience of inherent to parenthood in the first place. Our case then directly takes this down because they don't give a case about how a world absent this narrative makes things meaningfully better for parents for the rest of their parenthood as well, which is what you exclusively get from closing opposition as well, that you don't really get a fully nuanced account of from opening opposition with how meaning is actually constructed in the action that people take as a result of internalizing this kind of narrative, merely just that people might be edged to, take this decision insofar as it is a pre-parenthood debate. The second part of the extension is just the benefits to children, right? Because parents in their fulfillment is not the only stakeholder. And this is the other exclusive part of our round, is that, and this is why the start of my speech was not just a flashy intro, but important analysis, right? Because how do we view relationships normally, speaker? We oftentimes default to a transactional view of relationships because there are no relationships that we form are really unconditional, right? When we consent in relationships with other people, like our friends, our lovers, for example, we typically always do so, even if it's not always apparent, because there is some kind of extraction of value, whether emotional, financial, or otherwise, right? It becomes difficult then to understand that the relationship with your parents in most cases is different and doesn't require that element because those are the types of relationships that you're typically exposed to in your everyday life. The reason why this is important then is because this narrative is crucial for breaking down our default view of how relationships are, that assumed relationships should always be transactional, and to acknowledge that this unconditional nature of it is something that you should also find meaning in as a child as well. When my mom tells me that just me being happy is enough to make her happy and make it all worth it despite all the hardships that she's went through, that is something that I deeply internalize, right? The idea that my mom cares about my happiness in and of itself, independent of what I can ever provide for her, and that being unimportant, is something that makes me as a child also find significantly deeper levels of meaning within that relationship as well. A lot of people will tell you that, oh, I'm just in my family, or I like my family because, they provide me food, they provide me shelter and all that kind of stuff, without really finding a deeper aspect to that relationship that is in and of itself valuable, independent of what you can provide for each other in the first place. And that is precisely the view of relationships that this narrative breaks down uniquely on our side of this debate. I'll take a POI from opening if they have one. Closing?
Yeah. Okay. So all of this is still unclear why it would be good for people who don't want to have kids, rather than just, if you are the kind of person like your mother who will have that opinion, why you shouldn't then just have kids.
It might be true that, generally speaking, people might not want to have kids, but that's just that's just a given, right? Because of the amount of sacrifices that people understand you have to go through when it comes to having kids, people are generally not going to make that decision. But this doesn't mean that people understand that this is the right choice. It's just that what they think is the right choice in the short term, which is the analysis of the long-termism that I talked about earlier, and why this can be significantly more fulfilling than a world in which you do choose not to have kids. Finally, this is some refutation on resources, right? Like on the idea of state investment. When parents are supported, right, they can better balance balanced work and family responsibilities, contributing to higher productivity levels for the economy and all that kind of stuff. There's just many reasons for why states have an incentive to invest in parents, to give tax credits to parents and stuff like that. That doesn't have to do with this narrative about whether or not you should find this inherently valuable, right? I think this debate, like this argument itself, is symmetrical. The next thing on parenthood is bad for women. First of all, this is not just about women, where exclusively the narrative historically was that women should find this valuable for them and this is their primary duty. When parenthood is the broad conception of this, is also therefore applies to men as well. Even if this can apply to women disproportionately more, this notably is still at the very worst symmetrical for our side of the house, because there's still a lot of reasons for why women are pressured into like these kinds of relationships anyways. At the very least, this means that women who do find like meaning within these relationships feel empowered in that sense as well. For all these reasons, we're proud to stand in opposition.
Right, thanks. I'd like to thank you for that speech. I'm at the government whip when you're ready. Great, thanks for that speech. Now I'm at the opposition whip when you're ready.
All right, POIs verbally. I'll try to take OG, but not until about my 5th minute. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I used to hate debate because I used to lose debates, and I used to lose debates because I hated it and I never practiced. As soon as I started winning, that narrative flipped and I started to enjoy debate. We think that sometimes things become a self-fulfilling prophecy, and this is particularly true when you are dealing with something as abstract as the construction of meaning. Now, Tyler tells you that insofar as we now have a narrative that tells people that there is something inherently valuable in parenthood, that the sacrifices are ultimately worth it, even if nothing else changes in your life, parents find more meaning in that relationship, they feel happier, and children feel more secure because they feel that that relationship is not transactional. They know that they are unconditionally loved, and they do not feel as much guilt and as much pressure to live up to the expectations that their parents might put upon them. A little bit of weighing then in terms of why Tyler has already won this debate, and then I'm going to deal with the other teams. So what is our extension? I give you 2 primary points. Firstly, we tell you that you can find and create your own meaning within this parental relationship, and that this is much more likely to happen on our side of the debate, where people are told that there is some inherent meaning there if only they can find it. We think that this probably means people go out there and look for this meaning. Crucially, I think that unlike opening half, this does not assume that meaning is something intrinsic that either exists or that doesn't exist. I think that OO tells you why some people will find meaning anyways, because this is inherent. We say that yes, this is true, but there's also a subset of the population for whom, even if perhaps in the counterfactual they would not find meaning, they're now going to make an effort to go out there to construct meaning, to pursue this because they know it's a possibility. Secondly, then, we tell you that this is going to have an important impact on the way that children view their relationship with their parents and the way that they conceptualize the world. And I think this is incredibly important because kids are actually a really important stakeholder here. And I think if we can prove better outcomes for children, we're already weighing over everyone else in this debate. Why? Well, firstly, children don't consent to being born. I think parents probably do, at least to a degree, consent to having children. Therefore, we should probably prioritize children as the innocent actor. Secondly, though, I think they're younger. Their formative years are like substantially more important than the years that you spend as a parent in your 20s or 30s or whatever, at which point your identity has probably already been formed. They also have more years ahead of them to enjoy life if we set them up well. And they're the future. They're going to influence future generations, so we want them to be good. But finally, and perhaps most importantly, parents just value children more than they value themselves. And again, this is probably a product of the fact that they see this relationship as being meaningful. But we think that if one of the actors in the debate steps aside and says you should be prioritizing the other one, this is probably what we should do. I think then that like children are the most important actor, and Tyler has proven to you that they get better relationships with their parents and they don't see this as transactional. We think the way this manifests in real life probably means that children then don't feel as obligated to do things like make huge sacrifices for their parents or go into careers that they don't want to do so that they can like support their parents' retirement or something, because they understand that their parents probably chose to have them because it was a valuable experience to them, and children aren't really obligated to pay them back for this. We think this results in happier lives for them, but also we think that it changes the way they think of relationships. They don't see everything as being as transactional, and this probably makes them happier people overall. Okay, so dealing then with the cases from the other team. Firstly, I want to just deal with this claim about societal supports and the kind of programs you get from governments. I think this is largely symmetric. Perhaps there's a little bit more on our side. We'll throw you a bone opening opposition, but we think generally this is pretty symmetric because as every team in the round has conceded, there are reasons why governments want people to have children on either side of the debate. They probably encourage this to an extent in different ways on either side of the debate. We think that if they have the resources to create these programs, they will probably do it either way. But crucially, most states don't actually have these resources. Like today, only a handful of countries are actually very developed and have a lot of money kicking around to spend on these kinds of programs. But also note that this debate, at least to an extent, is probably historical as well. And historically, most countries have been like barely above the poverty line. They probably don't have massive numbers of resources. I also just think, though, that like resources to enable you to do something that you hate are probably less important than actually enjoying that. Okay, now onto the claim then that this is the tipping point to make you have kids, which is like the case from OG and CG. Firstly, again, bear in mind, most people live in poverty. Most people don't have the luxury of access to birth control, even if states try to promote this, because again, states won't be able to promote this. But also, I think a lot of the time people just don't think these things through, right? Like they go out there, they meet someone, they feel a biological urge, they have sex, and 9 months later, it turns out they have a child. I think it's better that they find some meaning in that as opposed to regretting that instantly because this is meaningless and you're going to waste 18 years of your life raising that child. I think furthermore, though, there are many other factors that make you have kids, like societal pressures, the fact that governments want you to have this, the fact that like maybe your parents want you to have kids or whatever. But even if they do have kids, maybe against their will, we think it's probably preferable for them to then find meaning in that relationship. We think, to steal some analysis from the EDC final, it's probably just good for children to exist because life has some meaning. We think that they're probably gonna like have a fun time existing. And we also think that there is a unique relationship that exists between parent and child that these people are likely to discover if they have the chance and if they are encouraged to do so. Finally, then, on this claim about oppressing women, a little bit of framing here, right? I think that there are many other reasons why women are oppressed. Like the reason they stay at home with children isn't because it's meaningful. It's probably just that women have to carry them around inside them for 9 months. So it like sort of makes sense that they would continue to stay home with the child. This doesn't really change. I think that crucially what does change on our side of the debate is that men also see having children as something meaningful and fulfilling. And this is, again, different from the counterfactual that we get about like duty, because if you have an obligation to have children or you're incentivized by government programs, men will probably like do their part and make the kid, but they won't spend as much time with it, or they won't take as much of the burden of parenting off of their wives because they don't see that as something that can potentially provide value to them or something that could be fulfilling. This probably means then that you get significantly less equality because women continue to be oppressed and now they have to do this thing that men don't see as being meaningful. That probably sucks for them. Okay, a little bit more framing then. So CG tells you that you're going to just be unprepared for parenting and this is going to suck and you're going to feel really disillusioned when you discover that the narrative was wrong. The beauty of this, though, is the narrative doesn't say every second of parenting will be great. It tells you eventually it's worthwhile. I think this is easy to reconcile with the fact that there are going to be some hard times. And I think that furthermore, people want to reconcile this because they don't want to be miserable. So if you tell them, don't worry, it gets better, they're likely to believe you. But also, we think that the payoff of like fulfillment is quite long term. It's easy to say, well, I'll feel fulfilled next year or when my child graduates high school or whatever the case may be. And we think that, again, the fact that there is this reward eventually in the future is enough to keep people going, to make them feel motivated, to force them to put in an effort. You're going to do a much better job of parenting if it is something that you think you enjoy, or at least you could enjoy. I don't want a world where parents have children because they have to, and they guilt their children with that fact for the rest of their lives, proud to win from closing opposition.
Great, thanks, Speaker, for that speech. Now, speakers for a very good debate. Invite you guys to